Good morning, everybody. Welcome to NICE, to the International Studies Convention. We are here today to talk about gender in international relation, which is the title of this particular panel. Gender in international relation looks at the question of security, the question of power and justice. It looks at not only the institutional processes, but also discusses the discursive level, these questions at the discursive level. Both feminism and masculinity studies have contributed immensely in this area. And we would be looking at certain areas of certain focus area on gender and international relation. We've got 4 speakers with very exciting topics here. I would like to invite the first speaker, Dr. Angira Sen Sharma. She is assistant professor at Center for Development Studies, University of Allahabad. And she would be speaking on understanding feminist foreign policy. Each speaker will have about 7 minutes for their presentation. We would be taking questions towards the end. So the audiences are requested, if you have any questions, once the speaker has finished the presentation, you can put it in the chat box. We would not be taking it through the mic. And all the answers would be taken up in the end if we have time for the discussion. So over to you, Dr. Sharma, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. It's a privilege to be part of the NICE International Studies Convention, and I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for giving me this opportunity. Today, my paper is titled, as mentioned by the chair, this Understanding Feminist Foreign Policy. And I must say this is a working paper, so I look forward for your comments and suggestions. So today we have 4 countries which has officially announced feminist foreign policy approach. And with 4 countries joining in as introducing feminist foreign policy, it becomes critical to understand the nuances of this approach. So Sweden in 2014 became the first country in the world to declare a feminist foreign policy, later joined by Canada and France. And lately in 2020, Mexico became the first country in the developing world to introduce a feminist foreign policy. And with Mexico opting for a feminist foreign policy, we can now see the approach moving beyond the rich, developed northern countries. So the critical question is now how a feminist foreign policy helps in addressing some of the pressing challenges that women and girls face today across the globe. So the struggle for gender parity or gender equality has a long history. The impact of conflict on women and girls have always been different from what it has been on men and boys. Sorry. However, women has always been in the sidelines when it comes to the discourses on peacemaking, peace building, or development issues. So before going into the concept of feminist foreign policy, I'd just like to draw attention to some of the major international initiatives adhering to inclusion of women on issues of peace and security. And that one very clear initiative has been the Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, which resulted in the historic Women, Peace and Security, that is the WPS agenda, which emphasizes on gender perspectives to conflict prevention and resolution, peace building, peacekeeping, rehabilitation, and reconstruction efforts. So we can see the prime focus of the WPS agenda was women's participation in ensuring sustainable peace and security. The former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of the UN Women, Lakshmi Puri, had said that WPS is an important rallying point of gender equality related multilateral and bilateral diplomacy in the hardcore areas of waging peace, assuring security, countering violent extremism, conflict-related humanitarian actions. So we can see the WPS agenda reflects the wider aspects of the feminist foreign policy, and WPS agenda is based on the 4 pillars, that is prevention, participation, protection, relief, and recovery. Now coming to the definition of feminist foreign policy, which I think is critical to understand what constitutes feminist foreign policy and how it is different from the traditional way of looking at diplomatic relation or international affairs. The Center for Feminist Foreign Policy has addressed a feminist foreign policy approach as a step outside the black box approach of traditional foreign policy thinking that is based basically on military forces, violence, and now it gives an alternate intersectional rethinking of security from the viewpoint of the vulnerable, which gives it a powerful lens. I quote from the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy that it gives a powerful lens through which we interrogate the violent global systems of power that leaves millions of people in perpetual state of vulnerability. Lyric Thompson and Rachel Clement, in a paper defining feminist foreign policy, has defined the concept as policy of a state that defines its interactions with other states and movements in a manner that prioritizes gender equality and enshrines the human rights of women and other traditionally marginalized groups. So we can see some of the main features in the feminist foreign policy approach, that it essentially questions the traditional patriarchal power structure with relation to diplomacy, aid, trade, and aid. It also provides an alternate way of looking at peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights issues. Now, I'll briefly touch upon, the 4 countries that have introduced feminist foreign policy. As I mentioned, in 2014, Sweden became the first country to adopt this approach, and which emphasizes on gender equality and women's rights at the center of its diplomatic agenda. And the foreign minister of Sweden, Margot Wallström, had said in an interview in March 2015 that feminist foreign policy stands for standing against the systematic and global subordination of women. So the basic 3 R's in feminist foreign policy of Sweden are rights, representation, and relocation. Now, Canada in 2017 introduced a feminist international assistance policy, which directed that its foreign aid would promote gender equality and protects the human rights of women and girls. So feminist approach of Canada was basically based on the development assistance. It covers 6 priority areas: gender equality, human dignity, which includes access to healthcare, education, etc., economic empowerment of women, climate action, women's political participation, and women, peace, and security. Now, coming to France, until 2019, France has used the term feminist diplomacy. It was only in 2019 in an op-ed by the Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs and its Minister of Interior, which for the first time introduced the term feminist foreign policy in France's...
Dr. Sharma,
yeah.
I'm sorry, you have 1 minute. Please wrap up your presentation.
Yeah. So I'll say that Mexico is one of the developing countries which has introduced feminist foreign policy. What are the main issues, when you talk of feminist foreign policy? People have criticized it as a normative soft power, but the counter argument is that it's not pacifism, but a mixing of hard and soft power. Another issue that how do we balance domestic and international commitment? For example, Mexico itself has domestically not been able to handle women's safeguard and women human rights. So how can it do it at international level? And in context of South Asia, there are scholars who argue that if you have a discourse on a generalized concept of gender equality, it cannot be replicated in very specific countries. So there are need for more culture-specific, state-specific nuances of feminist foreign policy. So today, in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, we see that there's an immense need for alternate ways of thinking, and for that, I think feminist foreign policy is a good platform. But at the same time, we also have to be very careful that there are more need for more discourses on feminist foreign policy rather than a generalized approach. And I would like to conclude by saying a quotation from Gloria Steinem, who had said that don't think about making women fit the world, but think about making the world fit women. And that is where I think looking beyond traditional approaches to security and global issues becomes imperative. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, you have looked at the question of feminist foreign policy with very specific focus on the question of security. You have also touched upon a certain focus area on development and how diplomacy really is helping regarding this area. You also briefly mentioned the 4 states who have declared themselves as adopting feminist foreign policy. I hope that there'll be questions and we can come to more details about your presentation. I'll quickly move to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Tamanna Khosla. She is director of Pranja Initiative in United States, and she would be presenting on feminism and international relation. Let's move to Dr. Khosla. Over to you, ma'am. You've got 7 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So the title, as the chair has also said, it's Feminism and International Politics, International Relations. So from the very outset, the feminist theory, has challenged the women's near complete absence from the decision making, and in the assumption the reality of women's day-to-day lives is not impacted by or important to IR. So, you know, the whole structure of international relation has excluded women in a big way. Rather than suggest that traditional IR was gender neutral, that is, gender and IR were to separate spheres that did not impact on each other. Feminist theory has shown that traditional IR is in fact gender blind. Feminist scholarship therefore takes women and gender seriously, and in so doing challenges international relations, formulated concepts and assumptions. The query on gender issue has entered international relations in 1990s. It has made space in international relations as late as the 1990s. Feminists have radically questioned international relations discipline. The question of how personal is political is not only just important to political philosophy, but it is equally important to international relations. International is concerned with survival and scuttle between. It's not just concerned about survival and scuttle of nation state. It is concerned about what its citizenry is, you know, and women have been treated as second-grade citizens. So be it war, if we look at Afghanistan right now, you know, like nobody's really bothered about women issue in the whole thing. The narrative is shaped around, you know, the way, you know, what's happening to terrorists are taking over, or the Taliban, the ISIS-K, etc. But where are the women? Women are invisible. So they are already second-grade citizens, and in a war-like situation, they are triply beyond that. And the ones who are poor would be even below in the rung to the urban and the rich class. Now, Second World War causes of war only in the 70s to gender rights conventionally considered to be belonging to arena of how politics were included in international relation discipline. Those enjoyed to include gender in international relations were wanting to make society more human. So, however, given the fact that conventional IR theory revolves around the relationship between the states and not with the emancipatory possibilities of humans within the nation state, the fact to include gender still remains on participation on discipline of international relations. Late 1980s and 90s, international relations included diverse voices. So, for example, in countries like India, where we have dissection of class, caste, religion, etc. You know, so postmodern feminists, for example, would say that, you know, you need to include all of this. So women are not in homogeneous category. So, for example, in a Islamic state, a woman would be woman rights would be given differently than in a democracy. So accordingly, you know, they have to see that how these diverse how these diverse voices have to be addressed. Sorry. So the narrative has to shift from powerful to the powerless, include experiences across culture, race, and gender. So we need to develop a gender lens to study international relation. Um, uh, the gender nature of international relation based, it's basically taken from political philosophy, where you have the division between public and the private. Politics of difference, the many thinkers who speak spokespeople of politics of difference say political sphere is composed of both men and women. It's not just men who are composing the structure of the world. It is half the world is owned by women, and that is what they have to grapple with. Alston says man as women, and women, man as warrior, and women the beautiful souls to determine the role in the war. So men are the warriors and women are the beautiful souls. So this thing has to be challenged by, is being challenged by the international relation feminists, and international relation needs to create compassionate cooperation. State violation of women's rights, it's not just war. For example, if we look at the whole concept of state, you have, when you have inter interstate violence, sorry, intrastate violence, you have when we had AFSPA, for example, in several northeastern states, it was said that women were raped brutally, and many of the Mizo women, they really raise voice against that. And so so we need to understand that it's not just interstate violence, but it's all intrastate violence, which where women, where the state turns a blind eye to violence against women. So be it communalism, inter-religious or intra-religious violence, for example, domestic
Dr.
violence.
Khosla, you have a minute. Please wrap up your
Okay,
presentation.
sure. So uh, so for example, developing world has to take care of, developed world still has taken care of it, but not to great extent. But this perspective has to come through in the developing world. For example, in the, as far as the state is concerned, women in developing world also based on donor perspective. So for example, if we take we take donation from World Bank, so we have to follow policies according to that. So it's not just states, but MNCs and corporations and the civil society which will influence. So yeah, so what space left within women to deal with market forces? So women have to deal with market forces as well, not just state. Need to look at local, regional, political, and international power structures. So these power structures have to be dismantled to include women in international relations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khosla. You have touched upon a lot of issues. Basically, you have established a border which sort of within which the entire debate on feminism and international relation takes place. So you have touched upon several issues, and I would hope that with specific questions, you would be able to look at very pointed areas which feminists have been looking at in international relation, raising for a very long time. We'll come back to you during the question and answer session. I move to the next speaker for today. Our next speaker is Ms. Shivani Mamgen. She's a research scholar at JNU. And for today, she'll be speaking on gender in international relation in the era of globalization. Over to you, Ms. Mamgen. You've got 7 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for selecting my paper for this international conference. My topic is gender in international relations in the era of globalization. So far, the concept of gender in international relations has remained unexplored. Feminism as an emerging theoretical tradition puts forward the significance of gender in the international relations. So to understand the role of gender in international relations and globalization, so it is very important to understand the term gender and where it stands in international relations. So people often confuse the term gender and sex and use them interchangeably, but this is not the case. The term gender and sex are two different conceptions, and it is important to understand why. So, sex refers to the physical difference between a man and a woman, whereas gender, on the other hand, determine how a person can be identified. Gender is socially created and actually influenced by the environment, as we all know. So the gender roles are well defined in the society where the term masculinity is associated with rationality, power, activity, strength, and the term femininity is associated with passivity, nurture, weakness. So this gender inequality can be seen in the international politics and global society as well, where men are always considered superior to women. Here, the focus will remain on the feminist approach that is showing the condition of women in international relations with special focus on the era of globalization. Now, my first subtopic is feminist perspective in the international relations, role of women and the contribution of women. So the feminist theory of international relations is a recent phenomenon which is not that old, which attempts to focus on the role of women in global affairs that has been neglected for a long time. They pointed out the history, structure, and knowledge of international based on gender. It is like it has gender biasness. Some of the key themes of gender, some of the key themes of international relations, they are based on such key ideas which reflect a style of male thinking, such as war, peace, security, diplomacy, and military affairs. Now we'll see the contribution of women as contrast to this. Feminist theories believe that although wars are mostly perpetrated by men, but the vast majority of civilian casualties are women. And in addition, women provided various support services during war and militarization, such as in world wars, such as family, medical, psychological, and sexual services done by women. But now we will see the gender biasness in economic and political sphere as well. Some international feminist scholars have demonstrated how the formation of the state and the international community can help create gender differences by dividing it into state and society and public and private spheres. For example, the division of private and public sectors always placed in private sector with having some unpaid housework. Besides the economic sphere, this gender division can be seen in the political field as well. Women make up less than 5% of heads of state and government and only make up 10% of their income, despite accounting for 60% of all working hours. So, this gender inequality shows the hierarchy of power in the international society and global politics, where men are superior to women. Now, we'll see the next interesting topic, that is the impact of globalization on gender equality. As we all know, what is globalization? Free flow of goods, ideas, values, services, people from one place to another, from one part of the world to the another part of the world. So we will see now the current wave of globalization is dramatically improving the lives of women around the world, especially in developing countries. However, it is in many areas such as education, employment, health, and civil rights, women are still remain vulnerable. For example, in the industrial countries, the process of globalization affects women differently than men. The cost of wages for women laborers are much lower compared to men laborers. Like in case of India, like India has the highest rate of gender discrimination at birth. According to an analysis of 2017 demographic data, India will continue its worst sex ratio in South Asia in 1915. So, and now we will see the positive and the negative impacts of globalization on women. Globalization has increased women's average wages in the present world. If we see the positive aspect first, globalization has increased women's average wages in the present world. With the growth of family income and globalization, women's social choice has also increased somewhere. The multinational companies offer jobs regardless of gender because they work in a highly competitive environment and select the best employees regardless of gender discrimination. It eventually inspires more women to get the jobs. And in case of India, with globalization, like in 1991, we got LPG, liberalization, globalization, privatization. After that, women had more job benefits. and many opportunities appeared in the form of new jobs for women. As globalization progresses, women's wages increase and their self-confidence and independence also increase. So globalization somewhere destroys the traditional ideas of patriarchy, and and it allows women to live in society on equal terms. Now we will see the negative impact of globalization on women. Globalization has not changed the situation of women. However, it has increased the level of exploitation of women. With the development of globalization, a process of global feminization took place, during which many male-dominated jobs were given to women. However, these jobs are still low paying, contractual and precarious, and social benefits are very low. There is more darker side of globalization if we see closely, which impacts women all over the world, that is sex trafficking of women.
Ms. Mumkin, you have a minute.
Okay, this darker level of globalization is the result of significant increase in sex tourism and transition prostitution of women and girls. And if we closely see the globalization effects on women, the nature of the incorporation of women into the industrialized work, such as women have always been part of the manufacturing industries more than the developed industries, which actually increases the exploitation of women. If I summarize my topic, we see the above discussion shows that feminism is very useful in international relations and raises awareness of women needs through gender-friendly research theory. These theories not only emphasize the exploitation of women by family, society, and the international community. Hence, the feminist perspective is helping in redefining the gender roles in international relations. Besides this, it is also providing an alternative model to think on ideas like rationality, reproduction, production, and human wants in the world society. As a result, several countries have initiated women-friendly initiatives, like in order to promote women empowerment in society. And in case of globalization, we can say it is not only provides women with enormous opportunities, but also new and unique challenges. So the root causes of gender inequality have many facets, and it is difficult to identify which forms of inequality have been eliminated and which have deepened as a result of globalization. So this was my topic.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mumkin. You have looked at several areas which feminists have been working on regarding women's position in international relations, with specific focus that you had was on political economy. We had at NICE a few days back a few prominent speakers who were really pioneers in this area and who had sort of started this debate, kickstarted this debate. And especially also the aspect where you suggested that globalization also has in many ways differential impacts, and it cannot really be straitjacketed in terms of understanding. So thank you so much for your presentation. We would come back to you for questions and answers. We move to the next speaker. The next speaker is Ms. Aparna Vijayan, and she is an assistant professor. She's an assistant professor in the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda, and she would be speaking on the good patriarch and the bad patriarch, reading gender through global South perspectives. Over to you, the next speaker. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. While there has been a gendered reading or a feminist reading of the global spaces and the international politics, the attempt that this paper, that I'm making in this paper, is to generate a sufficiently less patriarchal gendered reading, which, according to me, might be possible if I conflate the gendered reading with that of the narratives on the global South. So we shall just briefly look at how this possibly can be done. And let me just at the outset itself state that it's in the nascent stages, and I'm still exploring the possibilities of merging the two. So who is a good patriarch and a bad patriarch? Should I have rephrased that question to who is a good man and a bad man? Because we shall soon see how the good man, bad man narratives have been used in order to make sense of democracy and nationalism in international politics when we look at it from a gendered lens. So history requires to be seen differently every time there is the question of gender. In international politics, especially, the question is about the extent to which, theoretically speaking, national self-determination is worked out, and in ways it's legitimized. So nationalism and democracy forms two important principles that underlie international relations, keeping in mind national self-determination. And a gendered reading of these two principles, we'll just briefly go through the same because of paucity of time. Nationalism, one of the steering principles of international politics and relations, that does emphasize upon state sovereignty as the autonomous unit that resorts to so much of nationalism to create the concept of enemy alive, which is usually the narrative that nation states engage in. And this narrative is brought about in most of the contemporary discourses, from leaders running governments to civil society organizations, who, instead of critically viewing them, would engage in a celebration by invoking nationalist sentiments, which is not wrong, but it also legitimizes to a very large extent what the state can do. As Judith Butler writes, the state ensures and serves the matrix of obligations for citizenship. It decides it decides and creates situations to signify our belonging as well as the non-belonging. There always lies this imperative to create situations for the citizens and for the non-citizens. So this kind of a sovereign action gets materialized, making state a very huge empire. And this operation of a state, in its utmost powerful presence, gets fused with nationalism to ensure that such power structures continue to work and continue to keep the hyphen between nation and state alive. This logic of nationalism in international relations, when looked at from a gendered perspective, presents to us the view of a good man at home while the bad man is outside. So we have to, the state is protecting its people from the bad man outside while you are a good man at home. And that state shall keep the bad man from entering your home. So this was evident in many of the speeches that were given by different political leaders, one of which was by President George W. Bush, who said, the murder of a US civilian working in Saudi Arabia shows the evil nature of the enemy, the face of the barbaric people. So nationalism keeps the bad man out and the good man inside, which again is a very legitimate proposition. Now coming to democracy, which completely overturns this relationship. The masculinist protection in democracy turns the man into a good man outside and a bad man inside logic. So quoting Mae West, who writes, every man I meet wants to protect me. I can't figure out from who. This understanding of the logic of masculinist protection does enhance chances of the state using its rules, regulations, and laws to protect, to curb dissent inside the home, and to be a bad man inside, so that the dynamics completely shifts here. So democracy does legitimize its dominance and subordination that arises out of this masculinist logic of protecting. So the good man is outside and the bad man is inside. And this applies to all the states, which is reverse in the nationalist logic of good man inside and the bad man outside. So you can find patriarchy, carving its spaces out differently in both of these narratives. And you can find how the state uses both of these narratives, not just the state, even the society uses these narratives in order to legitimize most of their actions. And this forms the basis of the underlying principle of international relations, which itself means it's sufficiently patriarchal. So on what grounds can we make interventions in order to ensure a less patriarchal gendered reading of this IR, of the international relations, which is sufficiently already patriarchal? Here is where I would like to bring in Global South as a perspective, if I may call it for the lack of a better phrase, which provides to me some vocabulary to make sense of these power differentials without understanding them only as structures or institutions, but by helping me look at them as processes. So how will I read international relations if I apply Global South would be the next question, which I have tried. I have attempted to do so, though I don't have the time to describe or discuss what Global South is all about, because that's a very important question. Instead, the question I would ask would be, which I'm asking in this paper, is how do we make instead of how do we make sense of Global South, the question that we need to ask is, how did Global South emerge into what it is? What led to the creation of this narrative of Global South, which will sufficiently help us understand why it's very, very essential in a gendered reading, in a renewed gendered reading of international relations. As Walter Mignolo writes, by making sense of how the Global South emerged into existence, we'll get some idea as to what Global South is. How did it go on to become what it is, in order to know what it is and what it can be? So if at all there has to be a reimagination of the world order, it has to begin with imagining how state-centric liberal democratic order and nationalist discourses are used in the name of national self-determination, an example of which I just showed. So this perpetrates patriarchy, as we saw above, and the essence of which is brought out in I.M. Young's article on masculinist protection. But how can we now apply Global South? In the following 5 ways, and this is how I have tried to apply the Global South narrative in order to make sense of the patriarchy.
Ms. Pujin, you have 1 minute.
Yes. 1, by reimagining the way gender-based oppression takes place. So there are different kinds of patriarchs which no more can be fused into biological categories. The patriarch may take the form of a man, a woman, culture, state, community, religion, and the like. Hence, it needs to be taken beyond the good man, bad man narrative towards who the patriarch is, which could be anybody. Second, applying Global South narratives to the study of knowledge systems. Example, Vandana Shiva, who talks about the hegemony of dominant discourses, right from agricultural discourses to capitalism, that talks about controlling our subjectivities and mentalities. So, where she moves away from dominant discourses for sure, but she doesn't hinge herself in the discourses of only the powerless. She makes her way through the powerful and the powerless by critiquing the binary that exists between the powerful and the powerless. And probably Global South, it's not much of a geographical perspective or a narrative. It's more of a cultural narrative, which will allow us to negotiate with these borders. And therefore, a Global South application would allow us to negotiate with these borders, see through these borders, and change our perceptions of concepts such as market, development, dependency, interdependence, which were at length described in the previous presentations. So this Global South narrative, when applied to our perception of the political, forces us to connect ourselves to the horrors of the routine, so that we don't go with a fixed understanding of what is political and then study politics. We instead would want politics to define, the routine politics to constantly define our understanding of the political. And this is brought out beautifully in the work by Prathama Banerjee on the elements of the political. Lastly, the Global South narrative will also help us question the divide between nature and culture, political and politics, state, society, public, private, etc., which has been public-private has been sufficiently questioned by feminist discourses. But the Global South will allow us, with the help of gender, to question the other binaries that I just mentioned. Therefore, talking about these indigenous narratives are important, as much as it is important to see it from the center. So to create narratives surrounding powerless won't be enough. We'll have to merge, we'll have to navigate between discourses surrounding the center as well as the periphery. And that's what leads to what we call as global narratives, the global plus the local, which is one of the finest examples of this exercise, which allows you to shift your lens from one border to another to understand the movement and meaning of these discourses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a very fascinating and provocative presentation, and you have moved from the aspect of gender state to gendered international relations, and I hope that there are many questions so that we can take the discussion forward. Let me see if there are any questions in the chat box. Now we are open for a question and answer. We've got some time with us, so let's see if so we don't have any question as of now. Listeners, the participants can also ask questions. They can put it in the chat box if you're interested. There is a comment, and I would like the speakers or one of you or few of you to respond to this. there's a comment that was made which says just for input, in addition to advocating for feminist foreign policy, it is time to discourse on women's involvement in politics, diplomacy, and foreign policy decision making, since women are less likely to take drastic actions fueled by emotion and less likely to report experiencing emotions associated with power, such as anger or pride, than men. They are more likely to be committed for maintaining peaceful international relations. So I think this is more specific comment on our first speaker, which is Dr. Sharma. And if you would like to respond to this.
Indeed, political participation is an important aspect when we talk of feminist foreign policy. But I don't think that can itself, bring about major change. Then South Asian story would have been different, because I think South Asia, cutting across political system, cultures, we had number of, female prime ministers, presidents. So I don't think just being into political participation, be it in the legislature, assembly, or diplomacy, will make a major change. That is indeed one important aspect, definitely. But there are other areas which also need to be, taken into account when we talk of women empowerment. And the second part of the comment that, women are less likely to take, decision on basis of emotion. And I think that is a very biased statement. In foreign policy, how much we say, the real politics will determine the course of action. There you cannot say that women will not be emotional, men will be emotional. No, but when feminist foreign policy is in shape, one can be, you can more determine that women issues will be handled, or just I think one of the speaker, I think Dr. Koshala has pointed about Afghanistan. So now if the international community puts pressure on Taliban to address women issues, I think that would be a strong statement, rather than be talking about, women being less emotive or less prone to anger, which I think is a very biased way of looking at women politicians or women in the decision-making process. But definitely with political participation and in the decision-making, better role for women can go a long way in empowering women. But it has to be, when it comes to foreign policy, it has to be complemented and supplemented with many other aspects of empowerment and, broader policy-wise also. And it has to take into account, as I mentioned in the presentation, of the generalized structure. I think other speakers have also pointed out, generalized structure will not be able to handle it. It has to be state-specific, region-specific, and culture-specific also.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the participants, the presenters, for each other? If we have any, we have time to take those. Okay, so I have some questions and comments that I would like to present for the sake of discussion, and I hope that sort of opens up the category, and we can take these thoughts with us when we leave after this panel. First is on the presentation on feminist foreign policy. There are specific questions that feminist foreign policy is expected to deal with. And you have touched upon few of them. I would also like you to respond to the specifics on the question of ecological justice. The 4 countries that you have mentioned who have declared themselves having a feminist foreign policy, don't really have a very clear stand on the question of ecological justice, which is one of the pillars of feminist foreign policy. So how would you like to sort of with specific examples respond to that? To the second presenter, and actually it sort of also links to the last presentation. There have been, especially with reference to Afghanistan, there is a problem of the Western gaze that looks at global South, especially women who are positioned in global South, and that has been one of the problems in which has been happening in recent discussions on Afghanistan and several other places as well. So in the sense, I have this question for both the presenters, to Dr. Khosla and also to Ms. Vijayan, that, I mean, much has been talked about the gendered nature of state and also in private spaces, the way patriarchy operates. But what about the gendered nature of international politics, specifically when we talk about interventions or the withdrawals of international interventions? Because many a times the logic is that of the patriarchal protection. Militarism is justified, militarization of spaces are justified, and then you have these either invasions or withdrawal of invasions with specific reference to how the Western gaze kind of establishes the norms around which the discussions takes place vis-a-vis these interventions. So how would Dr. Khosla and Ms. Vijayan like to respond to these ideas? And to Ms. Mamgain, my question is, when we are talking about gender in international relation, we must also remember that there is also a very strong narrative about the marginal masculinity. And if you would like to sort of share a bit about in this area as well from your presentation. So if you can respond, the participants can respond to the queries.
May I? Or
yes, please. Yes, please.
Ms. Sharma, if you would like to go first. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. If we look at the foreign policy, feminist foreign policy approaches of all the 4 countries, it's only Mexico which has said something about marginalized. Other countries have not said anything about the marginalized group. It's only women. And which is very important because feminist foreign policy, if you look at the definition, they talk about not only women, but also the vulnerable, the marginalized group. I think they all have been silent on ecological issues because, as you have already pointed out, and if we look at the global discourses on environmental and ecological issues, women face the brunt on both sides. And from India, we all know how Chipko movement actually transformed the whole environmental movement and the environmental feminist movement. I think when one is looking at feminist foreign policy, one also has to look at all these angles. But I think that will take time because because most of the feminist foreign policy are now looking from the northern countries actually are looking more on the development assistance. They are equating women issues with the development aid approach. So once it takes shape, then it will get into other broader issues. I think Amazon area of Brazil will be one critical study when we talk of ecological justice and relate it to foreign policy approach. I think that's where countries have to basically wait and watch how this foreign policy approaches evolve over time. All these countries have introduced in 2014, but it's not to say that feminist or women issues were not discussed, but giving a shape of a foreign policy approach gives us more concrete structures. We have to see how things evolve over time, and ecological justice and ecological issues will definitely be a critical area which feminist foreign policy have to address in the long term. And I think once it moves away from more of developing countries participating and opting from feminist foreign policy, these issues will come more into forefront.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Can I respond?
All right. Sure.
Yes.
Vijayan, Ms. Vijayan, can I respond first? Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, Western gaze is surely for there, ma'am, but like what I would like to say is, I'll quote from Susan Moller-Oken's work, is multiculturalism bad for women? And in that she says that there are several cultures which are inherently oppressive to women. For example, she takes a lot of examples from Latin America, where rapists are made to marry their victims. And she says that, how polygamy is like, it leads to a lot of problems, because, people who are justifying this particular custom, they forget that, it leads to a lot of jealousy and, within the wives. And she also gives the example of whaling, as that it might not be very for young girls, who are like looking at West, and a globalized world which we are living in right now. So in that world, people are constantly interacting with each other through Facebook, Google, etc., etc. And it's not a very if as I take a stand for individual rights, individualism, as Ayn Rand would say. And I would take the stand that, individual rights are extremely important, and women as individuals have right to take a stand. And if they want to, Western cases for sure there. And, nobody is very excited about it, that is there. But I also expect that, people are wanting in India, for example, like last night, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta was also talking the same thing, about individual rights, and if a group can't give individual rights to me, then how can I expect the West to give me rights? So in India, we have to, within our own groups, we have to give rights, to expect West to give us rights, because now it's a multipolar world. We have different kind of rights for different kind of people, but I guess individual rights is the most important aspect of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Vijayan, before you take up the comments that I had given, there's a question that I think you would sort of be interested in answering from the audience. Will the movement movement for non-binary, gender fluid voices come from within the scope of modern feminist approach, or will it transcend a new school of thought? So if you would like to respond to this as well, Ms. Vijayan.
Sure. Yeah, I did get hold of that question while I was working out a response. So thank you for the question. Actually,
and you have 2 minutes.
Modern feminist discourses go with a certain understanding of the other and the self. And it revolves around the understanding of a fixed othering, which rightfully is required at its nascent stages. Probably that's what also influenced the women's movement across the globe. But what I'm claiming in this paper, or what has been claimed as part of the Global South perspectives, is that it's necessary to move beyond the existing feminist discourses, not by negating it or keeping it aside, but by working out a way of moving beyond these borders, moving beyond these binaries, which won't then fit within the modern feminist scholarship. It is a way of working out probably a lesser patriarchal understanding of the international relations through the perspective of gender, but not rooted in a fixed understanding of the other, which is what helps us because if we root ourselves in the other, we are othered, because if I'm the other, I am associating myself as the other based on what the self told me. So in a way, I'm also substantiating this binary between the self and the other while I'm talking only about the other. So Global South narratives would say you negotiate with the border, you function on the border. It doesn't require you to use disciplines. It is not interdisciplinary, it is non-disciplinary. That's what even Vandana Shiva talks about when she questions sustainability or the violence of the Green Revolution. She doesn't use a certain disciplinary framework in order to question these binaries. It's an open field. It is not, so exploitation doesn't see disciplines and then activate itself. It is something which is an open space, which definitely questions the binary. So at the same time, it doesn't mean the binary doesn't exist. It is to find out or to figure out the border, how this border works, how our identities are framed when looked at from the understanding of the border, which means we'll have to navigate from the perspective of the self as well as from the perspective of the other, which also in a way generates a response to the question that Ma'am Chair asked on the gaze of the Western domination. That's why this not rooting yourself in the other is very, very essential. That's why it's necessary that we also move ahead theoretically as well as practically, beyond the feminist discourses, because then we just fix ourselves in the other. Another concern about this is, which is the last point, that when the other, we tend to homogenize the other as a fixed category, which doesn't necessarily cater to all diverse experiences of all othered women or children or men as well. Because even feminism, as much as gender discourses, also talks about the structure that exploits men and women differently. So I think it's necessary to move beyond these discourses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We actually, we have finished right on time. So I would like to keep it that way so that the rest of the sessions today don't get impacted. So I'll reserve my concluding remarks. I'll reserve my comments. Just one thing to say, that all the presentations today have in their own ways, in their own specific ways, opened up various areas of discussion. We would invite all of you to open up these categories to have more discussions, and I hope that everybody got a lot of food for thought. Thank you all the speakers for your brilliant ideas that you agreed to share with us, and also the fact that you were very kind to me and you kept within the time limit. So thanks for that. Thank you to all the participants who were here and who showed interest in not only this particular session, but also the other events that NICE is doing. I hope that you have a great day and a vibrant sessions that are gonna happen. Please be there for them. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention, and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.